And all about Richmond. But most of us know that the trade in enslaved Africans started in Africa, and if you really wanted to get into it one day over wine or coffee or juice, there's a whole bunch of people, again, who have a lot to bring to the conversation, but the way in which the Pope divided the planet and gave half of it to the Spanish and half of it to the Portuguese so that they wouldn't fight over the spoils of the New World is a fascinating introduction to the discovery of the continent that we now live on by Europeans, and then what unfolded after that. But one of the things, one of the reasons I start that way is to say that the trade in enslaved Africans was enormous. The United States itself got a very small portion of that. The vast majority of Africans were taken to South America and Central America, which means their history of struggle, of enslavement, of plantation practices versus urban practices, all of that is a little bit older than ours. The English, in fact, had to wait a little while until it was clear that the Spanish weren't actually going to be able to compete up here along the Atlantic coast and in the Chesapeake region before they felt strong enough to be able to come in and begin with the Roanoke and then the Jamestown settlements. But in the meantime, there were an enormous number of Africans in places like Mexico. This marker, called Mexico's Sanctuary in Resistance, is placed here for two reasons. One is because I think it's very important that we understand our context in the global trade, in global commerce, understanding, that we are a part of a larger dynamic in all kinds of ways. But in terms of business, geopolitics, we're a part of this dynamic. Well, in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, as the domestic trade in enslaved Africans is rising to a peak here in Virginia and in New Orleans, the Mexican government is actually assisting enslaved people who are running away from the United States to escape slavery. So I'm going to read this a little first, and then I'm going to tell you why we placed the marker in addition to the fact that you just ought to know this stuff. The Mexican federal law of July 1824 promoted the emancipation of enslaved people, stipulating that the government was prepared to compensate North American owners of fugitive slaves. In 1829, Afro-Mexican President Vicente Guerrero signed a decree banning slavery in the Mexican Republic. Texas to Mexico routes to freedom constituted a major but unacknowledged extension of the Underground Railroad. Even after the loss of Texas in 1845, Mexican officials refused to formally acknowledge Texas independence on the grounds that it would be equivalent to the sanction and recognition of slavery. Mexico's principled stand on slavery was a major reason for the Mexican-American War of 1846 and 1848. In which, let me start the sentence over again. Mexico's principled stand on slavery was a major reason for the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, in which Mexico lost half its total territory. And yet, in its 1850 treaty with the United States, it still refused to provide for the return of fugitive slaves. This is a very important dynamic if you think about the fact that we in this country celebrate Juneteenth. And Juneteenth, of course, is that date in 1865 when the enslaved people of that area finally found out that the Emancipation Proclamation had been put into effect 2 years before, but in truth could only be enforced where there were federal troops. It was in 1865 that the federal troops finally arrived in Galveston Bay to let them know that. But at this time, we are talking about a territory that is still primarily, in terms of population and traditions, very much a part of Mexico. I'm from California. Before I came here, I was born in Los Angeles, and so that is a part of the history that I understood way better than the Civil War or anything that took place on the East Coast. So this has been equally interesting for me to begin to connect all of these histories together. The second reason that this marker is here is in honor of a delegation of family members who are traveling through the United States to bring international awareness to the fact that 43 of their children were kidnapped and presumed killed in the town of Guerrero, Mexico, last September. And the government did charge the mayor and his wife, implicated them in this event, but they have closed the case and have not provided any information to the parents. So there's an entire town of people who are going through this tremendous grief because they have no idea what happened to their children, actually. They were, when I say children, they were all younger, students, college students, that age group. So this is an enormous crime and a tremendous injustice, and there is a group of 5 who are in Richmond this weekend who are doing some events, and we had talked about what we would do to demonstrate solidarity with the family, and one way to do that would be to acknowledge that we have this long-standing relationship with Mexico and our struggles against state violence, and that with the Black Lives Matter movement and with the struggles against police killings and a lot of the dynamics that poor people tend to have to face in a repressive situation, we thought it would be a very important thing to acknowledge this history, because again, this is something that's going on that is a part of what we're doing here in Richmond. So we need to understand the implication of things that we do locally and how they spread out and affect people all over the world. So this is for those parents who are here and for their children who, if something miraculous happens and they actually can be returned and they haven't been killed, then we will have made a small gesture on their behalf. So I'll give you all a moment as I walk to the last stop. Coming this far to get to this point where we're standing on the site of the Lumpkins Jail complex, which was known by neighbors and by the black community at that time as the Devil's Half Acre. And one of the reasons that it was known for that, and I'm going to go ahead and read it from the marker, is not only did Robert Lumpkin for nearly 20 years buy and sell thousands of enslaved people, he was also known for breaking rebellious slaves. The most famous case was that of Anthony Burns, who was a frequent runaway and was captured after escaping to Boston. He unsuccessfully petitioned the courts to remain free and was returned to Richmond and held in Lumpkin's jail. He was punished in that jail by being, during his incarceration, he was chained to the floor for long periods of time. Later, his release was secured by abolitionist friends, but the conditions of his confinement were so horrific that he did not live long afterwards. Even so, a brief speaking tour based on his published story furthered the cause of abolition across the country. Lumpkin's jail operated until the United States colored troops marched into Richmond, and on April 3rd, 150 years ago today, liberated the city from Confederate rule and ended more than 150 years of slavery here. Greeted by thousands of people, both black and some working class and white, mostly immigrants, the troops held a celebration rally on East Broad Street, just north of the now liberated Lumpkin's jail. Robert Lumpkin died shortly after, leaving the jail complex to his wife Mary, herself one of his former slaves. Mary Lumpkin later leased the property to a northern missionary seeking to establish a school for formerly enslaved blacks, and this is the origin of the historically black Virginia Union University. The other component to this story involves the United States colored troops marching into Richmond, and they did in fact march in from Rockets Landing area into Richmond, came through Shockoe Bottom, opened the doors of these slave jails and released people, and it was quite a sight for people. And to my, really I'm quite disappointed. I have misplaced the document that I was going to ask one of you to read, and that document was a letter from a chaplain named Garland White. He was with the colored troops. He was himself a self-emancipated black man who came back with the troops to Richmond. And while he was moving through the streets, he had been asked by his troops to speak to the crowd. And after he spoke in what was an incredibly moving series of remarks, some of his soldiers came up to him and said that there had been a woman inquiring about a Garland White, and that she had posed a series of questions that made them think that maybe they should bring her to him. And they did, and she grilled him the same way that she had grilled them, which was basically to ask him where he was from. And he said Hanover County, and who was his mother, and he said her name was Nancy. And she asked where he had been sold, or to whom he had been sold when he was a boy 20 years before. And he said to a man named Robert Toombs, who actually later went on to become a senator in Georgia, involved in the Mexican-American War. And then she asked him his name, and he said Garland White, and she said, and where did you escape from Robert Toombs? And he said in Washington. And then she said, and where do you live now? And he said Ohio. All of those were the same questions that she had put to Robert Toombs when she had run into him in Richmond, because he was a high-level political person who was involved with the Confederate government. And so, having this corroborating information, she looked at him and she said, Garland, this is your mother, who has been grieving for you for 20 years. That reunion took place here. But he went on to say in that letter that there were many such reunions that took place that day in the streets of Richmond. And I really think that that letter, if we get a chance to read it to you another time, or you can Google it, but it is nice if you can find someone who's really good at oratory to read a letter to you like that, because the language is so amazing. But it is really one of the things that for me represents everything about what is so remarkable about Shockoe Bottom. It is this point of convergence for all these histories, and what makes it so valuable to us that we know it now and that we have an opportunity before us. And so on that, I'm not going to talk too much. I'm not going to talk any longer, actually. I'm going to let you all go. They're going to put up the marker. And then I really encourage you to visit as much as you possibly can during these 2 more days of events this weekend. All of these stories are incredibly important to who we are as Richmonders, but who we are as people in this country. And there's just a ton of things that you can learn, and 1,000 different points at which you can touch it. So I'm not going to tell you have to follow one thread. You find the thread that floats your boat and makes you sing when you go home, and let it take you where it will take you, because that's how we get things done. Because you have to have the will and the heart to put into it. So I appreciate you all wanting to go on this walk with us today, and I hope that it's helped you see this history in Shockoe Bottom a little bit differently than you have in the past. Yeah.